Hi, I'm Seamless, and today is Friday, which means it's time for our new How to Bass tutorial. And today I'm going to show you how to make this sound. Neat. Before we get into this, I want to remind you guys that I am having a sale on lessons. If you want to have a one-on-one private lesson with me over Skype, which is how they work, you can do so until the end of June, till the end of May, which is to say June 1st, for $40 an hour instead of the regular $90 an hour. The $90 an hour price comes back on June 1st, and if you schedule a lesson before then, you get the regular $40 an hour price. And by before June 1st, what I mean is that you can schedule it to be later. You can schedule it to be in June or July, probably July at this point, and that's fine. But as long as you get the scheduling in before the end of June 1st, then you still have the sale. After that words, it's $90. Anyway, this whole sound, it's a citrus, it's some stuff, and it's a whole bunch of fun. Now, this is what it sounded like at the beginning. So this whole thing is a series of strange decisions because I actually planned to do something wholly different than this, and ended up scrapping it, but I'm still using the remnants of it from original bits. And some of the decisions that were still here were not made for this sound, but stuck around and ended up becoming some of the reasons why the sound sounds this way. So, for example, operator 1 here, while not being FM at all, just going out, isn't even out all the way at the highest level, and I'm controlling its volume. And like all of this is being linked to the one automation that's controlling the bandpass that's happening in this filter that's coming up, because of course there's a bandpass filter in this. Like this, all the automation is still that, so like I changed the mod X sort of range here to fit that, so that even though this is the range that is moving around, it's still applicable to its job here. And the reason why this was important before is because once upon a time operator 1 was modulating stuff, but right now it's not. However, it does still have an impact to change level like this, not just because it gets louder or quieter, but because of its interaction with distortion, which we'll explain when we get to there. Get to distortion. The other thing that happens is that this guy, oscillator 4, is being FM'd by oscillator 5. Oscillator 5's volume is staying on the whole time, so it's not being changed at all. It's just on all the way. Oscillator 7's volume is not. It is being turned up and down with a slightly different curve. And there were reasons for this curve, but the reasons don't apply to anything now. It's just that this is the way it is. And notice that this guy's at ratio 7. This would be normally like if it were at ratio 14, which actually matters a lot because right now we're at ratio 1. And I guess it doesn't matter that much because what's happening is that even though this is like off pitch, like it's not a root note. It's not part of the thing. I mean, it is because the ratio is multiple, so that means that's what's happening. It's 7 times not 7 times. I don't know how many times, but it's an octave, and so if it were ratio 2, it'd be 14 instead of 7, which is still, I guess, odd in terms of that. It's really kind of confusing to think about ratios that way, but it's a different thing. But it's being FM'd by a ratio 1 thing. This ratio 1 thing, however, on mod Y has pitch control. So on top, the top half of the automation is a 1 octave higher, and the bottom half is the bottom half. This is 1 octave, rather than normal octave. And if you're familiar at all with anything I've ever done, then you'll already know why this is important. Because what this does is that if you FM something by an octave higher than the fundamental, you get square-based harmonics versus saw-based harmonics. So that's why in this automation going on here, that's why we get in the beginning there's this. That's the square-based version, and then here's the saw-based version. There's no smooth it's like a solid thing. So like any amount of automation that's above 50% will be the square. Anything that's below will be saw. Some of that you can see sort of switches here. Like I doubt the switch is kind of on point or whatever. I just kind of move it around until it sounded right to me, which is sort of all I ever do. And that's not anything. So then the first step is to get distorted, and I'm using this particular wavy line here. This is smooth stair type in the line list of line options, and the purpose of this is that it actually causes a slight bit of sort of squelchy behavior. And initially, with the other sound that I was trying to cultivate, I wanted to have a more squelchy kind of profile. I obviously still do have sort of a squelchy profile, but it's not because of the wave shaper. It's helping, but it's not really a part of that. There's a flanger happening in here, which by itself sounds like which reacts really weirdly, and that's mostly because it's so low that like the way that it responds with the distortion isn't really true for when it's combining itself with this, but it's mostly there to. It's like super subtle, but it does stuff that I like and I hear in there. You can of course increase it. So that's sort of what that's for. As far as settings go in here, it's kind of a high delay thing, high delay and high depth, and there's no rate going on, so it's just kind of staying here, except the fact that I'm modulating delay. Or depth rather. And the difference here is that in the controller linking window, I've actually inverted the position so that when this goes up, it goes down. Because when I at one point in time I actually had it like in front of stuff, it was a lot more the audible, and moving it up or down creates an up or down sort of pitch shift a little bit, and that so I felt a little bit better when it was going the other way against the motion of the bandpass. Right now it's just kind of there as an extremely subtle addition of just stuff really into this bandpass. So this is a bandpass I'm using in the EQ2 like I like, but it's being set to I guess order 8. Really? Okay, it's a lot steeper than I thought it was. So it's steep. And it matters more than sort of usual. Like if you go to like a regular bandpass filter, right, and you just set it to be bandpass, and it's like, yeah, cool. The default, at least in the EQ2 here, like the default this mode of it bleeds on either side. And even if I made it really short, there would still be frequencies coming out of either side. Now I don't actually have to go to steep to make it not do that. If I go to any of the other kinds, it'll cut completely. So that one's up there the way that it is, and it's like about as big as it gets. There's still some like EQing going on in here because as it moves around with it, it's still, alters its position. So EQing is still actually viable inside of EQ where you were doing filtering stuff, which is kind of interesting. And then that goes into the second distortion, which at one point in time was asymmetrical, and I got rid of that now for this because I wanted to switch between saw and square type harmonics. And if you ever wondered how to get not square type harmonics out of distortion, you do that with asymmetrical distortion. Because if you distort symmetrical waveforms like a sine wave, that kind of thing, triangle wave, square wave, you get square wave harmonics. Obviously, if we distort a saw wave, it's going to already have saw wave harmonics, so you don't have to worry about that. But I wanted to, when it was square, I wanted to stay square, so I brought it back to symmetrical mode, and then this is just big and sharp, and I moved it around until it was a thing that I like. Like there's some theory about like what shapes in the wave shaper do certain things in a certain way, but it's mostly I just put stuff down until it sounds right, and then I just kind of remember how certain things sound, and there's probably reasons for it, but I don't really think about it too hard. Then it goes into another EQ, and am I automating something in here? What the hell is activated? Band 1 frequency. Oh, I must have automated this. First tried to automate. I don't remember. It's a high pass filter, but I did that to cut the sub so that I could put in the sub from the earlier bit, which is just the same. It's from the same source, so that like it still had the same automation and motion, that kind of thing. So it's related, which isn't always the easiest thing to do if you separate it completely and use a completely different sub, because then you gotta try and match it up with it there, and you can. It's certainly possible, but it's also sometimes if the source material is actually usable in that regard, then it's sometimes easier just to carve it from the original, and that's fine. And then it goes into a vocodex, but there's some weirdness in this vocodex. To start, I have the low pass and a high pass both bleeding in. That's what that sounds like. That's just, there's no actual vocoding happening in here. And the vocoding sounds like this. So then I just mix between the two. Well, the three. So the way that the leveling here works is a bit odd, because you notice that when I was all the way up on the wet, that it sounded like it was only the vocoding. And then like when I steadily came down, it wasn't even really so much that like it got quieter, is like the rest of it got louder. And it has to do with A, because I'm compressing all of it, but B, because the sort of the levels here are all relative, kind of, in the way that it works with vocodex. Even without the compression, if I had the wet all the way up, even if I had these on at all, it still wouldn't be really there present. So that's what's up with that. The SG is on only like the littlest bit, but not so much. I actually have it on draft mode, and I have everything here on the lowest quality possible settings, just because I wanted to see if I could. And turns out I can. Draft actually does sound different, like a lot, in vocodex. And actually, the way that I have it sound in the draft now is the way that it did sound when it wasn't the draft before. But then when I put it in draft, I moved it until it did because I wanted it to be a draft. It's really kind of interesting how the subtle difference is. But like most of the time, when I turned all the EQs onto not high quality mode, and that had like no impact on what I was doing with the EQs, even the one with the bandpass. So I'm cutting off the lows inside the actual like vocating, so that like I can put in the lows with the real one. I also have got this weird business in the band distribution. So the band distribution window in Vocadex is a bit different from like the bandwidth or the pitch. Even the pitch, which moves the bands up and down based on sort of it moves the activity, the rendered activity up and down, I guess, and that's kind of what that does. The band distribution just full on moves bands, and like creating this shape, it's really hard to visualize it like the way that they have it set up here, but because you can see that there's like this frequency spectrum that shows up, but like when I play it, like these bands aren't representative of kind of what happens. Really, the frequency spectrum is actually on its side here. If I move the mouse around, you can see that it gets higher like, up in the upper head here, or just down here too. But you can't see it because my camera's there. You can see that it gets higher when I go up here and it goes lower when I go down here, and that representation is to say that like these bands are being like up here, but then they're also being down here. So like the frequencies are being mirrored, like from the bands that exist are here, like they're here the way that they are, but they're being moved, and like you don't see it until you look over here, where the bands are all like squished together and strangely just messed with. Like it's really hard to explain. One day I'll find a good way to explain it, but most of the time, like I use it in a much simpler way that's a lot easier to tell what's happening. But in this particular example, this is actually a bit weird, and it does have quite an impact on the sound just by moving it around. Indeed. The bandwidth is up a little bit, and the pitch is a bit down, and these have, their impact that they have, and it's supposed to just move it around until it sounds neat. I did nothing in the modulator pitch shift. Actually did nothing at all. Cool. And the bandwidth, I just cranked up the bandwidth on the higher ones, because there's like 4, and I didn't want the whole to be like... And like I moved a little bit like around the side of the low end, but like that was mostly experiment that didn't change anything, so I just kind of left it alone. That's it with the Vocadex, and then it goes into another EQ, which is pumping up the highs mostly, and then it goes into Maximus, which I'm doing some things. So I cut up represent stuff that's supposed to represent. Here's the bass, and that's fine. Here's the mids, and I'm doing this sort of up down compression thing, or I guess down up technically, because up down usually will squash it from up to down into being in middle position. So if it's too low, then it gets pulled up, and if it's too high, it gets pushed down. But this one is a bit the opposite, where if it's too low, it gets even lower, and if it's too high, it gets even higher. So this is up-down expansion, I guess. And really what that does is that it makes the sort of the transient of the mids much more transient, and it sort of increases the dynamic of it. And that's really happening in the mids, and the highs, they're actually being pushed up kind of a lot. But you notice that like the post gain is down on a lot of these, and so what happens is that I compress them pretty hard, and then I brought them down to be sort of its makeup gain, but it's in the opposite direction because we're expanding things. And then on the top end, I just have a limit, but then I'm also using the soft saturation, but I'm using it in sort of the way that it was intended versus the way that I usually use it, which is just to be like a solid like distortion on some things. I'm using it as rounded distortion. And what it's supposed to do is it's supposed to emulate the way that tape distortion does what it does, where if I were to run like a sine wave, actually we can look at it like this. So if you look at a citrus, and if you do something like this is sort of just what's referred to as saturation. If you push it hard enough, it eventually becomes a square wave. But what tape saturation does is that like where this would clip in like the digital world, this is sort of this rounded, more softer curve, and it's still causing distortion, but it's not as harsh. That's really all there is to that. And that's just what happens when you overdrive tape. When you put a signal that's too hard, like too high to go like up where tape is, the level of tape and how like it's really the magnetic physicality of it. It's weird. It makes it so that the distortion acts like this instead of clipping in the way that we're expecting it to do it in sort of the digital world. the primary reason why a lot of people say that like analog distortion is more musical than digital distortion, which I really don't know what that word means in this context, and it may or may not, but it's honestly the most subjective thing you could possibly think of, because whatever sounds good to you is what sounds good to you, isn't it? And that's kind of it for this sound, isn't it? Because this is the sub and this that. Well, all right, so automation. Let's talk about automation. I have a lot of examples of different kinds of automation, because this is a very expressive sound for not a lot of motion in the automation. So, like this first guy here, you can see that like there's still sort of motion down here, but it's like off by like down here, and that has to do with like the strange decision of like volume that we did before. Oh, and I wanted to mention why that was special because of distortion. Well, because of the way they were distorting this and distorting this guy especially, like a lower level sort of input does not necessarily mean that like this amount of level change doesn't come out as that much level change coming out of it. What happens is that it goes less into distortion, and so the distortion will behave differently. So we're actually creating slightly more modulation with the sound because of the volume change going into distortion. And this is true for the other guy as well. So like, and because they're different, they interact differently at every part of the modulation like position, and that creates extra motion. So if you ever messed with like the preamp, pregain rather, inside distortion, that's more or less what that's like, because the level comes out more or less still at that level, but the color of the distortion changes. And if you get a more complicated type of distortion, the more complicated that change in color becomes, and it becomes honestly its own neat source of modulation itself. So, and all that does is changes the gain of the signal going into distortion. So that's all we're doing inside Citrus, is changing the level of the signal going into distortion. And that's why that's important. But in the automation, like for this moment, like you can see how like just not going so high and then going a little bit higher creates just a tiniest bit of extra sort of tone to it. And like whipping it around like this, because we're already using a real bandpass filter, which is to say, well, a real digital bandpass filter, which is to say not a linear phase one or one inside harmor, which means that it's gonna really whip around the phase relationship of the harmonics that are in the sound. So moving higher faster like this actually means that we get a bigger shift in the phase, the pitch rather, because when you move the phase of something while it's playing, you change the pitch. And so like this motion versus this motion, like this motion is still changing the phase of it, but not fast enough for it to be like super noticeable, versus that, which like suddenly becomes this really whippy thing. And then there's like this motion, which like that motion of the automation is really quite straightforward. And notice how like the height change, and also this guy here, like the lowness of it, like between low and high, like that's a kind of a tone difference you get out of just the height of like the more you go with the automation. So like this kind of sound, like I've heard styles of music that had this sound a lot, actually a lot of Virtual Riot tracks, and I honestly assumed that there were different sounds with different modulation types to make it to have those different kinds of tones, but nope, it's just the same thing but with lower or higher automation. And then of course there's also sharper automation, which is also fun. That's like a time. And also what matters is the MIDI. There's also like there's a fun one here that I didn't do because it was too similar to this guy, but watch what happens when I do this. So pitch motion in here actually matters quite a lot. And also I have like more than one note there, because I do have unison engaged, and it's a lot of voices. It's a little bit like it does contribute quite a lot to the tone. And honestly, sometimes I like the not pan version, and there's actually a reason for that. It's because when you have different voices like this that are pan left and right, that means that the signals are only interacting left and right. There's obviously some crossover because it's not fully panned, but the more panned it is, the more it becomes a distortion of this channel, a distortion of this channel versus a distortion of everything. So it's not forcing everything to interact when we're panning a little bit. So if I have all the panning off completely, Like the phase cancellation, the phase relationship of there being different pitches and different starting phase has much more impact versus if I have a completely panned. Obviously, it's not like a huge difference, but it's enough of a difference to notice, and that's not just because it's panned wider, because the tone is actually different, especially if it were just a voice. Kind of up to you to determine whether or not you like, one version of this or the other, but I tend to like some amount of it because the phase cancellation is creating its own sort of addition to the tone and the modulation of it all, which is why I restarted the notes over here when I did, because I wanted there to be consistency of tone for those particular moments of modulation. Also, near the end, I guess I didn't do it this time, but sometimes what I would do is I would like on the sharper side of things, I would restart it every time I don't want it to be sharp. But the automation, honestly, is because it's one of the EQs and there's not a lot of smoothing involved. It's pretty goddamn sharp regardless. So that's good. That's important. And I believe that to be it. So this patch will be available to download in the description of this video, and I guess I'll make a surface with knobs so that you know what to automate. But I want to warn you that it's actually possible that you're not going to be able to open this. And it's not because I'm using the FL beta. Although if you do have the FL beta, you might be able to open this. And that's because I kind of screwed up my FL a little bit, and I'm using like an alpha wrapper to solve a problem that like got solved, and I never went back. And then when I tried to go back, it was borked. It's one of the reasons why this is happening in my piano roll. But what that means is that I don't I'm not 100% whether or not if you open this, it'll actually open. So if that happens, I hope you paid attention to how I made this. Yeah. Anyway, if you have any questions about this, please let me know. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and all that. And also don't forget that I'm having sound lessons. And as usual, have a nice day.